We made ourselves clear to the army and the passers-by, indicating that we are the press. Then within seconds there was the first shot.
Much of the mainstream press in the West have once again failed Palestinians, which is not at all surprising, but they've also failed one of their own. As a journalist, an Al Jazeera journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, has been killed by Israeli forces during a raid in the occupied West Bank. Yet, that is not how much of the mainstream press within the West is framing this. Once again, trying to insert both sides into a story where all on-the-ground reporting indicates that she was killed by Israeli forces. Now, before I get to their absurd framing on this story, first, Abu Akleh was a veteran reporter, worked for Al Jazeera since 1997, and was well known to Palestinians as someone who actually told their stories, actually cared to report what was going on for real on the ground to the people that were engaged in the occupation by Israel. Now, before I get into more of this, I want to play for you here a cut together news report from Al Jazeera English that covered this. I linked to their full video below this video on YouTube as well. But here is essentially their report on what happened, including some on-the-ground accounts of people who saw what happened.
The body of Shireen Abu Akleh is carried through the town of Jenin in the occupied West Bank. The veteran Al Jazeera reporter was shot dead while covering a raid by Israeli forces. Another journalist was also shot and injured. The Palestinian Health Ministry says they were hit by bullets fired by Israeli soldiers.
We made ourselves clear to the army and the passers-by, indicating that we are the press. Then within seconds there was the first shot. I told them that we are being targeted, we are being shot at. I turned and found Shireen on the ground.
The Israeli military says its forces came under attack in Jenin and that they fired back.
There was no exchange of fire, so there is no possibility whatsoever that a Palestinian have shot Shireen Abu Akleh. The Israeli army always uses these excuses to cover up the crimes they are committing against Palestinians, including Palestinian journalists.
There are human rights organizations, for example, like B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, that decided a long time ago that they are no longer going to even interact with the complaint system within the Israeli army because it is not serious. It doesn't find Israeli soldiers guilty.
Shireen Abu Akleh had worked for Al Jazeera for 20 years. Colleagues described her as brave, kind, and a voice of Palestinians.
Okay, so quickly here, just for more context, here is where Abu Akleh was killed in the northern part of the West Bank in Jenin. Now, before I get to the press's framing on this issue, even though it's very clear from reports on the ground, journalists telling what happened. This from Al Jazeera. So Al-Samoudi and other journalists at the scene said there were no Palestinian fighters present when the journalists were shot, directly disputing an Israeli statement referencing the possibility that it was Palestinian fire. Quote, "We were going to film the Israeli army operation, and suddenly they shot us without asking us to leave or stop filming," said Al-Samoudi. So Al Jazeera, of course, this is their reporter, their journalists on the ground. They saw what happened. They know the facts. They properly frame this as Shireen Abu Akleh, Al Jazeera reporter killed by Israeli gunfire, because that's what happened. Yet, that is not how most of the press is reporting it. Even though, as it's laid out here from Hein Hassan saying, if a journalist is shot and killed in front of multiple journalists who all say there were no armed Palestinians present, just Israeli forces who fired at them, then that is enough. Enough for journalists and headline writers, not to mention clashes. Rest in power, Shireen Abu Akleh. This should be enough. In any other scenario, if reporters are on the ground discussing what happened, they saw with their own eyes what happened. In any other case, that would be taken as the story. Oh, this is what happened. These journalists, these professional journalists saw what happened. Yet, when Israeli forces kill a member of the press or someone innocent, all of a sudden it's clashes, or this side says this side says this, when there is no both sides. It is clear what happened. Now, I'm going to show you the headlines here in a second, but Look, if these reports from the West, from places like, I'm going to show you, Axios, AP, New York Times, if they laid out, hey, this is what the Al Jazeera journalists are saying, they have a decades-long history of reporting things accurately, this is what they say, and the Israeli Defense Force, they have a long history of lying to protect their own, here's what they say, then fine, that's proper context. You're laying out who said what and the context behind that, who those groups are, and their history of lying or not lying, then whatever. But that's not what these reports do. They simply say, hey, Israel says this, and the journalists on the ground that saw what happened say this. So some of these headlines here. Axios. So most of the issues here are that they're vague, but I'll get to a really crazy one from one outlet in a second here. But Axios writes, Palestinian American Al Jazeera journalist killed in the West Bank. Again, any other case journalists saw who killed them, they would say killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank. But no, not here, as vague as possible, because it's Israel committing the war crime. CNN Business here, Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh shot dead while covering Israeli military operation in West Bank. Again, not telling you who did it. AP, Al Jazeera reporter killed during Israeli raid in West Bank. Again, not telling you who did it. BBC News, Al Jazeera reporter killed during Israeli raid in West Bank. Again, not telling you. New York Times, Al Jazeera journalist killed in West Bank. This one, just plainly both sides. The network and Palestinian authorities blamed Israeli troops for the killing. Israel said the blame could lie with Palestinian gunmen. It's not just the network, like actual journalists with a history of telling you the truth, reporting things accurately, say Israeli troops killed her. Israel, that lies to protect their own, say that she may have been killed by Palestinians. The intentional vagueness here is obvious. Now, Forbes, this is the most insane out of all of them. Writing here, Shireen Abu Akleh, a well-known reporter, died after being hit in the head by a bullet. Hit in the head by a bullet. Like it fell off the shelf like a book. Hit her in the head, and then she died. How did it hit her in the head? Who knows? I don't know. She hit her in the head. She died. Now, B'Tselem, which is mentioned, they were mentioned in that report by Al Jazeera. They did some investigating here, saw what Israel is claiming happened, and called them on their bullshit. So they write here, this morning, B'Tselem, field researcher in Jenin, documented the exact locations in which the Palestinian gunmen depicted in a video distributed by the Israeli army fired, as well as the exact location in which journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. Documentation of Palestinian gunfire distributed by Israeli military cannot be the gunfire that killed journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. So they show here on this map where Shireen Abu Akleh was killed and the location of the fire that was coming from an armed Palestinian. So they are not near each other. She was not killed by a Palestinian. And again, this is an Israeli-based human rights organization, one that has stopped taking reports from the Israeli Defense Force seriously because of how often they have lied to protect their own forces. Now, let me get to a couple last things here. This tweet from Palestinian writer Mohammed Al-Kurd, who says, Shireen Abu Akleh, 51, what a loss. Killed not despite being a journalist, but because she is a journalist. Her killers will roam free, and privileged faculties at faraway American universities will reprimand their students who speak out against the regime that killed her. Now, before I get to this last thing, which is a video remembering Shireen Abu Akleh, I think we should explore, why is the media doing this? Why does the media feel the need to come out to defend Israel when they have so clearly committed another war crime? Now, part of it, I think, is because the West is an ally militarily with Israel. There is this desire for a lot of allies of the West for the media to sort of dance around these subjects and not be clear about what is actually going on. There is a fear of blowback. There's also a fear of being called anti-Semitic for calling out a government, which is absurd, but that is how far right the conversation has gone, how they have taken over this conversation, where you are not even allowed to criticize a far right-wing Israeli government because you may be considered anti-Semitic for calling out a government. That's how a lot of people view this issue. It is completely insane, but that's, I think, also part of the reason why the press is afraid to call out these obvious human rights abuses. I mean, you have Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, other human rights organizations that have already come out to say that Israel is committing war crimes, that Israel is committing apartheid. They have been very clear about this. Yet still, press, especially in the West, have been afraid to address this head on and have continued to dance around the actual human rights abuses, the actual war crimes that are going on. Last thing here. I want to share this video that was shared by Al Jazeera English. This is a quote from Shireen Abu Akleh saying, "I was able to convey the people's message and voice." So not long after her killing by Israeli occupation forces, Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh spoke about her career and what it meant to her to report on the occupation. And I'm going to end on this video.
لن أنسى أبداً حجم الدمار ولا الشعور بأن الموت كان أحياناً على مسافة قريبة. لم نكن نرى بيوتنا. كنا نحمل الكاميرات ونتنقل عبر الحواجز العسكرية والطرق الوعرة. كنا نبيت في مستشفيات أو عند أناس لم نعرفهم. ورغم الخطر كنا نصر على مواصلة العمل. كان ذلك خلال عام 2002 حين تعرضت الضفة الغربية لاجتياح لم تعهده منذ احتلال عام 67. في اللحظات الصعبة تغلبت على الخوف، فقد اخترت الصحافة كي أكون قريبة من الإنسان. ليس سهلا ربما أن أغير الواقع، لكنني على الأقل كنت قادرة على إيصال ذلك الصوت إلى العالم. أنا شيرين أبو عقلة.